Hi, this is Paul. Last night, my wife actually woke me up because I was snoring, and she was frustrated enough that she woke me up enough that I decided to get up and let her fall back to sleep without the anxiety of me snoring, and was able to actually put together a bunch of thoughts that I was working on tomorrow afternoon. I actually tried to make a video, and I didn't actually delete the files, so I might put them at the end of this video. They'll probably be far longer than the rest of this video. Some of you might find it interesting. We'll see. But I woke up in the middle of the night and started responding to some stuff on Twitter. And it's really dangerous waking up in the middle of the night and writing on Twitter, because this morning I woke up and I thought, was I fully awake when I was writing this stuff? I'm not sure. Anyway, I started writing on Twitter, and very quickly I realized that this was something that I would want to put on my Substack. And so that is the origin of meaning making as first personal appropriation of the third personal. And so what sort of developed last night was a little bit more language to try to get to understanding Jonathan Pageau and what's going on in this little corner of the internet, and get some more language for it. And so the subtitle of this Substack is, "Why is Jonathan Pageau so hard to understand for many?" Now, some of you know that I have this Substack, and what I use this Substack for is usually to do video summaries or accumulate a bunch of things that I'm sort of disciplining myself using the structure of Twitter to write. And so if you're not subscribed to my Substack, subscribe. It's free. I don't know if I'll monetize it at some point, but I'm not monetizing yet. All of my posts on it are free. You will get a message in your inbox about it. I usually post them on Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, you probably have email and you can get it there. Usually I write a Substack after I do a video, and in this case, I wrote a Substack after I did a video that I didn't publish. So a lot of this is to get an idea about, okay, what are we really doing here? Because a lot of human life is acting and behaving and talking before you really know what you're doing or what you're thinking or what's going on. And so the more I listen to Pageau, especially, when I listened to his take on the book of Genesis that he posted on Jordan Peterson, that Jordan Peterson posted as sort of an interesting addendum to his biblical series. Why is Jonathan Pageau's take on the book of Genesis so different? And probably the best way to come to terms with it is that Jonathan Pageau is approaching the world from the first person. Now, I'm going to have to put on my headphones now. Some of you might also know that I have an on-again, off-again clips channel, and my reason for this channel continues to evolve. The channel's name is Vanderclips, and the link to this video and to the link to the channel is always in my notes below, but the links to this video would be in my notes below. This is just a little segment that I clipped from the Four Horsemen video. I've been playing around with reaping. That's Grim Grizz's term for, well, you can ask Grim Grizz exactly how he's using the term. My appropriation of Grim Grizz's term is grabbing these little tidbits from the internet, so I'm throwing them on my Vanderclips channel. I'm also trying to get little 2-minute videos that sometimes I'll post in my Twitter feed. I'm playing with that in terms of posting videos straight onto Twitter. I've been off of Facebook for a while now, over a year, and I know some of you have continued to, my volume is way down low. Here, that's better. Sorry, you don't have to mess with your volume again during this video. Some of you have written me on Facebook Messenger, and I haven't gotten back to you because I haven't looked at it for a year, but now I've been posting stuff that we're cleaning out in the church on Facebook Marketplace and thinking maybe I should clean up my Facebook account. Delete a whole bunch of past stuff like personal pictures and things that are in my Facebook account, and then maybe use my Facebook account more for work, because that's how I'm sort of using it now. Anyway, so here's a little clip of Jonathan Pageau making a point in the Four Horsemen video responding to John Vervaeke.
The image that you use, which is the idea that we project meaning on an objective world. Already you can see the alienation that is bound up in that very proposition, which is, okay, so where are we then? We're not in the world. We're like these kind of ghosts that are floating above reality.
Now, if you watch Jonathan Pageau's talk with Rationality Rules and Adam Friend did, both of those conversations are prime examples of Jonathan trying to articulate the fact that he sees the world through the first personal instead of what is now the public convention, which is seeing the world through the third personal. Okay? So the first personal is seeing the world as we see it, going chronologically through time from a first-person perspective. And as Jonathan Pageau always says, the world lays itself out. Okay? And that's in many ways a lot of what his project has been, is being an apologist for the first personal, let's call it.
You use, which is the idea that we project meaning on an objective world. Already you can see the alienation that is bound up in that very proposition, which is, okay, so where are we then? We're not in the world. We're like these kind of ghosts that are floating above reality. Like
ghosts that are floating above reality. That is exactly what I've been talking about for 4 years in terms of a monarchical vision. Mono, which is one, monarchical, which is highest vision, the one highest vision, which is exactly what science tries to do. And as Jordan Peterson talked about in the transliminal videos, we sort of depersonalize the world in order to gain this view. It's sort of like Woden losing an eye so he can have knowledge. That's the monarchical vision. That is the third personal. And what the public convention has been since the Enlightenment has been the third personal. Because the first personal was seen, it was part of, Vervaeke nicely talks about this in terms of, I'll see, now I have to go back to the other clip that I made. Now I'm using some software that isn't really nicely recording the audio. I'll continue to work on that, but it saves me from downloading the file and going through that. I'm always looking for more efficient ways to reap, more efficient ways to take what I'm looking for. So here's this other video.
Related issues around ideas of levels of being, which is, I think you're right. All of you have said this, and this is, central to the phenomenology of intelligibility, but it seems to be, contradicted by something that, starts with Scotus and goes through Occam and goes into the heart of the scientific revolution. Is there's no such
and so you can see the journey towards this, of course, actually starts, as Vervaeke is right, before the scientific revolution, before the Protestant Reformation. Scotus and Occam and nominalism, and that's been pointed out by many, many people before this little corner of the internet.
Thing as levels. This is not the reality just is, existence isn't a predicate, and those kinds of things. Now, I'm not mentioning these things to espouse them. I'm mentioning them to try and indicate there have been very profound philosophical historical developments that have challenged this phenomenology, and that part of
now phenomenology too is in many ways sort of a first personal approach to philosophy, and that's part of the reason phenomenology got going, because it got to the point that the person was lost, and people, to what degree people were conscious of that, but the attempt to try to reintegrate the subject back into philosophy. Again, that's pretty esoteric, which is why I'm liking first personal and third personal as ways of sort of scaling this thing down in a way that I think many, many more people can appropriate it, because most people have an understanding of first person grammar and third person grammar. And in some ways, that's also a nice, really shorthand map of the division of the 4 Ps within Vervaeke's system of third person as propositional and first person as the participatory and the procedural and the perspectival. There's the third one.
The task, I don't want to be presumptuous. Part of what I see my task of being is to try and take the very best of science and answer all of those challenges in a way that restores confidence in the hierarchies of intelligibility and the phenomenology of connectedness.
Okay, now that all sounds, for most of you, that's just like whoosh, way over your head. Well, what is Vervaeke trying to do? In many ways, he's trying to do sort of what the IDW tried to do in terms of the social culture war thing and their own little scientific disciplines that they felt in the university, that with the recession of modernity, that science was getting eaten away. Vervaeke does fit into that group, but he's looking at the culture war stuff and saying more heat than light. He's got opinions. Every now and then you can pry one out of him, but for the most part, he's avoiding that because he's saying these things are manifestation of a much deeper thing. And Vervaeke says, I'd rather address the far deeper thing here than get lost in the distraction of all of this stuff. I mentioned, I did a bunch of writing on Twitter this morning. Jordan Peterson's status rocket ride cost him his career as a university professor. It cost him his career as a clinical psychologist. Vervaeke, I think, wisely is sort of sidestepping the status rocket, even though he's having a nice little status staircase that he's working on, which I think is very appropriate and is actually a far better, humanly speaking, a far better way of pursuing an agenda and getting a message out there, a status staircase instead of a status rocket. Because you can actually hold your life together and, you're not going to get altitude sickness. So this is what Vervaeke is working on, a bunch of this really wonky, thinky stuff.
Now, that's one thing I'd want to say.
But what the Pythagorean...
Now, on this particular clip that I just posted on my Vanderclips channel, Vervaeke's been talking a lot about Neoplatonism, and so I thought, I want to do a little bit more background. I want to find some more stuff on YouTube about Neoplatonism. And these Arthur Holmes videos that Wheaton has put up, and they've been up for years. He's really a fun lecturer. He's really an excellent lecturer. So these are also, when I think about sources, these are also things that evangelical Christians aren't necessarily going to be all scared about. Oh, this is coming from Harvard. Oh, this is coming from University of Toronto. Okay, this is coming from Wheaton. Okay? And this is coming from Wheaton from, they took videotape of this guy in maybe the 1980s or something. So, everybody can sort of settle down and not be too worried that some cabal of progressives or academicians are going to hoodwink them. This is Arthur Holmes just basically walking through the ideas of the great chain of being. Now, I'm not going to play this here. I intended this to be short because I have a 12:30 lunch appointment, and so this is going to force me to keep this short. It's already longer than I thought it was going to be, because what I really wanted to talk about was what I wrote on the Substack, which I am actually just sort of winding up, just reiterating, which is the reason that I can never write anything, because I'm perpetually rewriting what I intend to do as I go and then never getting to a final draft. Anyway, so Pageau, in a sense, stands on the shoulders of sort of the rising at the peak of modernity, the recession of modernity, the crisis of the subject, and his entire approach is the first personal. And so the first personal is the way that he approaches the book of Genesis. And in many ways, Peterson is not as far into this as Pageau is. What made Peterson's biblical series, his Genesis series, so powerful was that Peterson is always trying to not lose the third personal. And maybe I will include at the end of this video the dregs of an unfinished video that I worked on yesterday and never, just basically abandoned because I didn't like how it was shaping up. Back to the So Pageau is much more disciplined on sticking to the first personal. Peterson can't quite do that because he's a university professor and because he's a scientist. And so the scientific view sticks with the third personal. It sticks with a monarchical vision. And so the dregs of the video that I'm going to post at the end of this video, which has Gavin Ashenden, and I knew, Skip, I was thinking about, I know you left a comment, Skip, on the video before, so if you're watching this, Skip, I knew you were going to react strongly to Gavin Ashenden, because Gavin Ashenden has totally, rejected Jung. And of course, Skip, those of you who know Skip on one of the Jung channels, Skip's a lover of Jung. And so Gavin Ashenden has completely rejected Jung. And so when Gavin Ashenden engages with Jordan Peterson's material, Gavin Ashenden has, left the Anglican Church, rather high status in the Anglican Church, and went to the Roman Catholic Church. And so Gavin Ashenden is Gavin Ashenden. Agree, disagree. He's just out there, but he's an interesting voice. And so I included him in the whole video about the transcendental or about the mystical. Anyway, so Peterson always has to deal with the third personal. And so when Gavin Ashenden is watching Peterson process this stuff in a room full of Cambridge academicians, Gavin Ashenden is feeling the tension here. Pageau basically sticks in on the first personal because he doesn't have to leave it, because his entire theology can fit into it. His reading from Genesis can fit into that. And so Genesis for him is always true because Genesis lays itself out in the world as we see it. Peterson was always flipping between the third personal and the first personal in his biblical series on Genesis, because he is studying psychology, which is always sort of in the middle of the third personal. That psychology is basically attempting to study the first personal from the perspective of the third personal. And we'll have to see if psychology and the other social sciences, how they actually endure with the continual recession of the modern. We don't want to lose the third personal. It has tremendous power and it's given us tremendous benefits. But what we've seen is that the third personal is inadequate. And that's really at the basis for the postmodern crisis. And if you watch Pageau and Bishop Barron's video that they did together, that was posted after the Four Horsemen video, you'll see both of them, which is a position that I've had that said, and this position that Jamie Smith over at Calvin University has maintained, that, and what John Vervaeke is presenting, the postmodernism is also presented an opportunity for some breaking down and recognition of the limitations and the overreach of modernity. Anyway, back to the Substack. The Four Horsemen video opened with a treatment, and John and Jordan Peterson asked each of them to give a treatment of what meaning is about. And actually that little clip that I made of Pageau is from Pageau's, is it? I'm not sure. Anyway, when Pageau is asked to talk about meaning, he goes first personal. And when I wrote this first tweet, I didn't quite have the personal suffix on, which I think makes it a little better. Meaning is an appropriation of the third person to the first person. And actually, so I worked on the video, the dregs of which, or the tailings of which I will attach to the end of this video. So I worked on that video. I was frustrated, and because it's really frustrating to put an hour into a video and realize, this is crap. I don't want to post this. I mean, it's even bad for me, which is a low bar. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to post the deconstruction video because he gave me permission to share that. And I was really anxious to get that video out there because the video I posted today was really a good one. And then my wife is at home and she's dealing with school and COVID, and in terms of all the COVID limitations at school, and it's just wreaking havoc in a setting like a school. And so we have dinner, and then she says, "Oh, why don't I've watched some TV. Why don't you pick what we'll watch?" And so I wanted to see the weather. So I went over to the local news, and there was this interesting story about a standoff up in El Dorado County, which is up near Apple Hill, for those of you who live in the Sacramento area, where there's a standoff and there's some gunfire, and it was near a school. And actually, I couldn't find the teacher's aide, who I thought gave the best interview, because she heard the gunshots. And up there in the foothills, they're a little less spooked by gunfire than those of us who live down here in the middle of the valley in the city. Because if there's gunfire in the city, it's you don't want to have any of that. Up there in the foothills, someone may be hunting and, a little bit more comfortable with guns up there in the foothills. So, but this teacher aide or someone heard some gunfire. And so she stepped outside and said, "I wondered what it meant." And bang. Okay. That's the third personal. She heard gunfire. That's out there. That's the third personal. Gunfire. Bang, bang, bang. Objective, sound. A tree was falling and she heard it. And she asked, what did it mean? She was in charge of a bunch of school children. She was going to have to make decisions about the safety of the school children. Now, again, there was that school shooting in Michigan. And so trust me when I tell you, anytime there's a school shooting in the nation, that grabs teacher salience landscape, because teachers love their students, especially if they have little children like my wife has in her elementary school. And they're concerned about if they're a little hiring anxiety. And it's like, honey, the odds of a school shooting at your shoot, blah, 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 blah. It doesn't matter. I'm very low in neuroticism and negative emotion. She's higher than I am. And she's like, every time there's a school shooting, I always think, what would happen if there was a shooter here? How am I going to keep my children safe? So this teacher hears the shooting. What does this mean? Okay. What is meaning? There's something out there in the world, in the third personal, and she immediately has to translate it down into the first personal. That's the meaning move. From the third personal to the first personal. And that's very similar to the transjective. Now, Pageau had also made a video about, I remember him saying at some point, and I couldn't find it, some people say they have photographic memory. My memory is more phonographic. And I think that's true because I'm a little dyslexic. And so when I learned the violin in first grade, I learned in the Suzuki method. So I have a pretty good memory for things that I hear. And that's part of the reason that I do these clip compilations, because I can find things in books fairly easily. Kindle sort of messes that up, except that I can search for words in Kindle. But I can usually sort of remember a video and where in the video something was. And I remember Pageau saying something about, the objective subjective. And that's a lot of what we're sort of working on. And so when you listen to Vervaeke and his transjective, that's really what he's getting at. And so I found in the Jonathan Pageau November question and answer a question about the Vervaeke transjective.
All right, so Maximus Magyar asks, are objective and subjective useful terms for talking about reality while consciousness plays a role in all manifestation? How about John Vervaeke's word transjective? That's fine. I mean, I use the words, I tend to use those words a little subversively because I obviously don't agree. I'll tend to, for example, want to show that the subjective is objective in the way that people think about it kind of in a vulgar way.
And then he goes on to talk about transjective and the fact that sometimes, I mean, if you want to figure out what John Vervaeke is doing, here I've got 50 hours of video. Now, I'm not one to talk because I got a few hundred hours of video, and I'm not even bothering to explain myself in a systematic way, so I'm certainly not one to point fingers at this. But again, this is Pageau. It's the first personal. That's where he leads. And he's trying to do a little bit of translating from the third personal. Again, Jordan Peterson in his biblical series was very much switching between the third personal and the first personal. And I think that is really where you have so much of your meaning making. And I think that's true to a lot of what John Vervaeke has been saying. And I think it's true to a lot of what Peterson has been saying. But, my thick skull, and now Bishop Barron, which I thought, if you go back to I thought he gave a terrific answer to the meaning question. He went at it through value, which I think is another great way to go at it. But this is, I think, a lot of what we mean when we talk about meaning. Meaning making, or sense making in the Rebel Wisdom language, is taking that third person knowledge, shooter out on the highway, and asking, how do I take third person knowledge, hearing gunfire, and use it to act with respect to the students I love? That's exactly what was on that teacher's mind. The children heard gunshots, are scared. That's sense making that the third person sounds of shots might impact the first person. Potential pain, interruption of the personal narrative progress, our life in a sense, moving forward in time. That's really what our life is in a narrative way, how many of us really process and assume our life to be. It's a personal narrative progress moving forward in time. But as children don't process this very consciously, they just feel scared because we see patterns. And we see opportunities and threats. And children, they might hear pop, 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 and they might not recognize, they might not know what that is. Maybe if they've had more experience with gunshots, they know. But the teacher is an authority, and the teacher right away, what does this mean? It's exactly what she said on the videotape. And I thought that's exactly the right word. And this is exactly the interchange, the third personal to the first personal. In two conversations between Jonathan Pageau and Rationality Rules and Adam Friended, there was a lot of frustration and meaning making. Pageau confuses and frustrates people, and it's not clear that many people understand why. In fact, I've been listening to him for 4 years, and I'm just starting to figure it out now. But you shouldn't feel embarrassed about taking time to learn this stuff. This stuff is not immediately apparent, and even if we can grasp it in our own skulls, whether we can articulate it in a way that other people will understand, that's the challenge. Perhaps a way to figure out Jonathan Pageau is to see him as approaching the world from the first person perspective rather than the third person. Ever since the Enlightenment, the third person perspective is the one that is sanctioned for public life and governance. In many ways, that's what happened first in the church in the Protestant Reformation. We're not going to listen to the hierarchy. We're not going to listen to what the bishop feels should happen here. Now, a lot of that just sneaks back into Protestantism because you need to have both the third personal and the first personal to live. So the fact that this stuff sort of snuck back into Protestantism through the rear door, I believe in Luther that it's sola scriptura. Well, you're believing in Luther. So again, you never get rid of these dynamics fully. The scientific image is the one privileged for the public world. And again, that in a lot of ways really developed strongly in modernity and became the modern stance. Third person is public, first person is private. Now again, look at Jordan Peterson. He's deeply modernist, but he's just there on the cusp. In many ways, Pageau is over the hill and can comfortably go over the hill because he's a YouTuber and an icon carver, and it's like, he doesn't have to be a scientist. Peterson has to deal with scientists, and so he has to deal with the third personal. Now in the recession of modernity, Pageau reprioritizes, and again, this is a function of priority, the first person perspective that is most clear in his exegesis of Genesis 1 on Jordan Peterson's posting. Every time Pageau says the world lays itself out, he's invoking the first person perspective. That's really what he's doing. I remember Mary Cohen picked up on that right away, and she said, every time he says lays itself out, and, I'd heard that, 2-3 years ago, and it still hasn't gotten through my thick skull. Now, again, you might say, Paul's being hard on himself. Do not worry about me being hard on myself. My wife will tell you, I have an ego the size of Texas. I doesn't, every now and then I'll think, I'm just not smart enough to manage this stuff. The slow pace of my cognition and my learning is to your benefit, because if I can think slowly and work things out and discover language, I can share it with you. So high status and astronomical IQs are not necessarily something to aspire towards. So anyway, it takes me a while to figure this stuff out, but hopefully by the time I do, I have some language and some ability to share it with you. And again, for my tremendously rambly long videos, that's part of the process. And hopefully after doing it a few years, I will have better, succinct, communicable language to share and to refine with you all. Of John Vervaeke's 4 P's of knowing, the propositional is third person, but the participatory and procedural and perspectival are more first personal. See, right there, this is part of the reason I like sort of thinking in real time, because someone might say, Paul, when did you develop the first personal, third personal language? I say, I did it somewhere around 2:20 a.m. on December 8, and I did it right there in the middle of that tweet. Knowing the propositional is third person, but the participatory, procedural, and perspectival are more first personal. And bang, there's a little bit of insight and a little tiny paradigm shift in my little noggin. Well, it's not that little as far as noggins go. Meaning making is the transjective frame switching between the third personal and the first personal. Third personal applied to the first personal, leading to the first personal knowing and acting. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. That's really where meaning happens. And this maps, a monarchical vision, and then again the personal, just back and forth, back and forth. That's how we live. So, all right, I did pretty well on time here. I think, well, it gives me a little bit of time to include the what's coming now in this video. Feel free to skip, because what it is pieces of a video that I abandoned yesterday. But it might be interesting to you because you can see I'm working through the language there. And I didn't really have it. And it took, this is all insight. And it's like, the shamanic thing where things are disrupted. So I abandoned the video and I went home and I'm watching this random news question. And this teacher comes out and says, I heard shots and I had to, what does this mean? Bang. And I had a usable definition of meaning. And I had a usable way to talk about Jonathan Pageau. And I had a usable way to talk about the difference between Jonathan Pageau and Jordan Peterson. And I had a better picture for sort of the difference between Peterson and Vervaeke in terms of a whole bunch of things. So, yeah, this ends the intentional portion of this video. And what follows are the scraps of a video that I would have posted today, but I abandoned. And so I know how y'all are. YouTube shows me the analytics. Very few of you make it to the end. And so if you're one of those who makes it to the end, hats off to you. I don't make it to the end of every video, by no means. So, okay, this is the end of the better formed video. This is the Substack. If you want a link to the Substack, it's down below. If you want to get these Substacks in your inbox, subscribe to the Substack. It just takes an email address. One of the things I like about Substack is that there aren't any ads. I do have a WordPress blog that I use that doesn't have ads either, but that's much more a filing cabinet. This is sort of a way to get, I can only listen to one Paul video, PVK video a month, but I'm kind of curious about what he's working on and developing. Obviously, you can follow me on Twitter for that, but I do a lot more playing on Twitter with all kinds of other things too. But the Substack will give you a better sense of just little snapshots of what I'm doing if you're not the kind that has a job where you have to be in a car or work a trade or code or something like that. So, okay, this is the end of the other part of the video. The rest of this video are all the stuff that I abandoned but didn't delete. So, thanks for watching. Hi, this is Paul. Yesterday I made a video that eventually got titled Transformational Mystical Experiences That Are More Common Than You Think. And I went through some of John Vervaeke's conversation with, got to remember his name so I can get it right, Rick Repetto, and I had Gavin Ashenden and Karen Wong on the meaning code, and I mashed up some of that back and forth because they were kind of an interesting pair, with him being someone who left the Anglican Church to go to the Roman Catholic Church, very much having a concern about evil, and then the Rick Repetto having very interesting experiences that are somewhat analogous to church. And I promised a second part, and I was in the Bridges of Meaning open studio, and a bunch of people dropped in, and Mark, of course, who leaves immediate comments on my videos, Mark Lefevre, said, "Oh, good, well, you'll get to the second part." And it's like, well, I'm not sure I'll get to the second part that he thinks I'm going to get to. But that was a really productive conversation, because one of the things that he mentioned that sort of put a lot of pieces together for me was the idea of the larger container and how that relates to the individual mystical experiences. Now, I'm using mystical experiences for lack of a better term. I'm using it very broadly. I'm using it to address experiences that are in some ways out of bounds in modernity. Part of what happened in the Enlightenment is all such experiences would be labeled as private, not public, and therefore excluded from the public realm. And that's not without importance. That's not without importance in that, let's say you have so as a result of the video, of course, it's very interesting. Some videos flood my inbox, and because people want to share their stories, and that's wonderful. And as the point of the video was, many people have stories similar to that. It's not just psychedelics. Gavin Ashenden had a near-death experience as a result of drinking alcohol when he was young. Many people have had lots of experiences that the Enlightenment says keep private. One of the really good comments that I received from Senor Cebolla, that's Mr. Onion, said, "What grates me most about stories like the ones referenced here is not that they're fanciful or weird, but their significance is assumed. I've had such experience, and they've been related to me too. What I haven't seen is a strong reason to show them to the public." And I think that comment in many ways illustrated the Enlightenment agreement that the upper register would stay private and the lower register would stay public. The difficulty that you have with that, and this is brought out by Wilfrid Sellers' dichotomy of the scientific vision and the manifest image, or the scientific image and manifest, is that the scientific image is all lower register, but meaning, morality, those kinds of things all come from the upper register. So what tends to happen is that the lower register just sort of sneaks into the upper register and then suddenly appears sort of sneaking through, because you can't really keep them separate. So part of the point that Mark Lefevre had made to me was the necessity for, and then Manuel sort of brought this out, the necessity for a container as such, because he noted, maybe I'll get rid of this screen completely. What he noticed was that, let's get back to Rick Rapetti's experience. So he had these dramatic, mystical experiences. He very much needed them in community because the community held it together. And then when the community had a conflict and it broke apart, he left it. And this was part of Mark's point, which I think was important, where what happens in especially a world religion, and what happens when you have a system that is large enough to have not just proximal goods, but claims of ultimate goods. And I don't remember which conversation. I think it was the conversation that Peterson had with the narrative guy. There needs to be interconnected things all the way from the ultimate good to the proximal good. And that needs to scale. And so what happens, let's say you have a situation like Rick Rapetti, and he's with, I don't remember the guru's name, but he's with these 3 spiritual leaders, and they basically have this fight, and they all break up. Well, what happens generally if you're a Christian is that, well, if there's problems in your local church, you break up, and if you're a committed enough Christian, you either found another church, or you find another church, or maybe after a time of healing, you replace it. In other words, there's an entire ecosystem that affords reconstituting the search and the ideal and the practice. And so what I think you get with the emanation and emergence is that, once again, you can get into that middle space. Now, if you're curious about this, I thought the conversation was really helpful. I was also experimenting with what would happen if I basically flipped from having a little private Discord conversation and pulled a few people onto the main channel on the internet to see how that would go. And it went fairly well. Again, part of what I'm doing with my channel is trying to develop things as I go. And so once Mark made that point, I wanted to reinforce the insight and share the insight and catalog the insight for myself so I could go back to it. And instead of, let's say, taking notes and finding a place to do it, in some ways the easiest way to do that was to pull it onto the main channel, put it out there on the internet, and in a sense, store it in the cloud. Well, what's the cloud? The cloud is the collective consciousness congress of the community. And I know there's a lot of confusion about what I'm doing with this channel, because the assumption is when people come to this channel that, well, Paul is trying to establish a large YouTube channel. Paul is acting as, in a mercenary way, as a minister, and he's trying to make more Christians. Well, I am, because that's sort of deep into Christianity. But a big part of what I'm doing is trying to think together with these individuals on the Discord server, and with other people on YouTube, and with other people on Twitter, because what happens is that I say things and that goes into other people's minds, and there's some mutations that happen, and what comes back to me isn't necessarily what I was intending, but the difference with what comes back to me and from what I said is helpful for me to know the other forces and cross pressures and sort of the way that the collective and the community is thinking. And it's for that reason that I want to think together with people who both have heard enough of me so that they're sort of tracking with the conversation, have enough difference from me so that they can bring new things into the conversation that I can't know or don't know, so that they will challenge me. I thought Sam, at the end of that video, the video is entitled Follow-Up on Instability of Mystical Personal Transformations. Sam, I thought, had a lot of really apt things to say about the whole psychedelic conversation. I thought Mark did too, and there was a healthy difference of opinion in that group on this subject. But what we're doing is we're thinking together. And as we think together, well, we grow in knowledge. Now, so again, what the insight that I really got from Mark in that was it an insight or was it a vision? The question is, why does Christianity work so well? Now, both in the comments and in the conversation a bit, you would get the sense from maybe some of the hand-wringing that I do and from some of the conversations that we're having here that Christianity is somehow failing. Now, while there are signs of trouble, certainly, for Christianity in places like Europe and North America, and I spend a lot of time attempting to address those difficulties, Christianity is massive. There are billions of people who identify as Christians. There are 2,000 years of thinking and writing and sharing that have gone into this. There's infrastructure. There's impact. I mean, Tom Holland, in some ways, in Dominion, has really articulated this. So Christianity is struggling, but Christianity is not failing. And I was going to address the Ashenden video, but maybe I'll start with the King's North video. Although before I get there, I want to talk a little bit about understanding Jonathan Pageau and the difference that he is bringing and what's happening in this community. One way to understand Jonathan Pageau is by thinking about first person, second person, and third person. Modernity continually tries to see things from the third person. So when Senor Saboya makes the comment that these things should stay private, on one hand, he's got a point. Because of the nature of mystical experience, they're solitary. I had this out-of-body experience, or I had this near-death experience. And so if you look at it, let's say, from the perspective of Vervaekean error checking, because, that's a lot of what John Vervaeke's program is about, to get at truth better. So if you look at it in terms of error checking, there's so much that is boiled in to an individual mystical experience that there are very good reasons for the public to be skeptical. Now, again, so often you get the sense that, well, Christians don't want to talk about this. People, evangelicals, charismatics, for all of church history, and even Reformed types and reformational types who are very rationalistic and biblicistic, we have always dealt with the question of individual perspective and interpretation. Someone comes to church and says, I just feel that God is telling us we should do this. We live in that context all the time in a church, and churches have developed elaborate religio, elaborate practices and protocols and traditions in order to deal with the reality of individual mystical experiences, individual opinions, all of those things. Churches are simply awash in individuals who have different perspectives, different interpretations, conflicts, all of that. And so a lot has developed in churches simply to try to filter that stuff. Even if you get to, let's say, highly reformational, rationalistic, biblicistic tradition, they might not be aware they are dealing with individual opinion and insights, but there's vast machinery and practices that they have developed within their church to deal with those things, and they do. Now, part of the way in which modernity captured the church was the emphasis and sometimes overemphasis on the third person. Because the monarchical vision, the sort of being pulled up to imagine we're seeing the world as it is, that is the scientific vision. And that's very much third person. Jonathan Pageau really is promoting, in many ways, the first person. And one of the things that much of his work assumes is moving from a first-person perspective out. All of the talk about attention, even his interpretation of Genesis in the video that Jordan Peterson promoted, that's very much a first-person perspective. Now, all of us simultaneously deal with first, second, and third-person perspectives. What tends to happen is that a hierarchy will develop in a community in terms of the evaluation of those perspectives. So modernity tends to reinforce the third-person perspective. Jonathan Pageau, and then when you hear Luke and a lot of people talking about personalism, they tend to emphasize the first-person perspective. And all of these perspectives are important. Now, what tends to happen with upper and lower register things is that part of the reason for the lower register and the development of the practices that come from the Enlightenment are because the propositional, the lower register, the materiality, the space and time coordinates all help us stay communal in a good way. Now, the communal is in many ways second person. It's I, thou. It's me, you. It might be me, you, and then me, you, and then me, you, because time-wise, consciousness is very monofocal. But that's the second person. And so what we often do is we sort of, with all the tools that we've developed of statistics, the tools we've developed in modernity, we try to swoop up, see from the third person, do analysis, then switch back down into the first person and act. Because we can't really act from the third person. All we can do is see. It's from the first person that we act perspectively, participatorily, and participation is really very second person. It's I, thou, it's me, you. But and so we're constantly switching between these modes. I haven't done a lot of talking about frames lately, but when I listen to a number of the conversations in this little corner of the internet, I think about frames. One of the things that we as human beings do to an amazing degree, far more than any other creature that we know or have access to, far more than the animals, is that we frame switch. I can mind read, to a degree, people that are around me because I can sort of see the world from their perspective. Now, it's never done right. It's never done perfectly. It's always selective. There's a lot of relevance realization happening that sort of focuses and limits it. But we sort of frame switch and we see the world from another perspective. And we keep doing that. And that's essentially what we do when we go up into third person mode. Then we come back into first person mode. And then if we're relating in second person mode, we're simultaneously trying to express something, but also trying to imagine what they're hearing. And so we just quickly frame switch back and forth. I'm still on the fence if I'm gonna go forward with the Kings North video first or the Ashendon video first. Okay, let's do the Ashendon podcast first. Now, part of the reason I had part one is because I wanted to do a little bit more biography with Gavin Ashendon. He's a very interesting figure. He sort of reached the height of the pinnacle of power in the UK and left it all, joined the Roman Catholic Church. And again, you can listen to Karen, you can listen to the Meaning Code channel for more background on him. He's a very interesting person. And whereas he had a radio career on the BBC, which basically it sounds like it was taken from him. He wasn't allowed. They were annoyed that he was reading the Bible on the radio for some reason. I don't know. And he no longer could be like vicar to the Queen or whatever post he had with that. And then he converted to Catholicism, and he's got his podcast. By the largest videos, the biggest video splash that he's had is his commentary on Jordan Peterson. And what's interesting about him is that has a background in Jung. He's got a background in psychology. He also has a background in theology. And so he's got a perspective to share on this. Now, Peterson has been able to go to Cambridge, and the Cambridge Union video, I think, was, again, one of the best videos that we've seen on Peterson's channel in a long time. But apparently Peterson participated in a small group discussion, which wasn't recorded. But it makes this video, I mean, is he telling tales out of school? I don't know. But there's a lot of Ashenden mixed in with this. And of course, it has to be from his perspective. And we're all used to sort of filtering things in that way. So there's a number of interesting tidbits in here.
A private conversation. What I want to do in this podcast is to talk about what I learnt about Jordan Peterson, what more I learnt about him through this visit and seminar at Cambridge, and then divide it up into three elements. The first one is his struggle with science or scientism on behalf of depth psychology. And then to look at his conflict with the will to power of counterculture, of wokeism, of cultural Marxism, of political correctness, which is, of course, what he's most known for, and for many most celebrated for. And then finally to give some further reflections on his relationship with Christianity, now that I know a good deal more about him and I've had a chance to speak to him. When Jordan and I got to speak privately to one another, it was obviously a matter for me of trying to decide what I could best say that would be most helpful. After all, I'd been hoping to meet him and speak to him for some time. My first impression as I met him was of a very tough man, but one tough in the sense that he was very well defended. We've all seen him come through a very serious period of illness and fragility. We've seen too the tenderness of his heart and how deeply moved he is when people come to him and reach out to him, and he's able to help them by giving them a greater sense of meaning in their life. And he has so many stories of the way in which people have turned their lives around just by the example he set them and some of the things he's spoken to them about. And we'll cover some of that as we look at his attack on wokeism and his defense of traditional, in fact, Judeo-Christian values, but also the values of competent therapy. So it seemed to me that he had moved past that period of vulnerability, and he'd almost as if he'd rebuilt himself and was now presenting a really very muscular persona. And he was also taller than I thought he was going to be. As we talked together, I thought the most helpful way to talk would be to say that I too had been a Jungian, but I had given it up. For a while I'd replaced Jesus with Jung to some extent, or at least run them together in parallel.
Now again, you can check out the meaning code where he goes into that in quite a bit more detail. It's got a very interesting story.
It's more accurate. I have never replaced Jesus. But then through an experience of evil, which I'll refer to later, I found that Jung's idea of the shadow was really wholly inadequate, not just inadequate, but in fact profoundly misleading. And so I said, Jordan, given the fact that you've been through hell, you've experienced enormous opposition with some of it very personal, you must have found yourself reflecting on evil and the way evil has steamrolled over you. And do you think that Jung deals adequately with what you've experienced? I noticed that during the time we were together, all day in fact, Peterson had two modes. One was when he was throwing a question that he'd thought about a great deal and prepared. And in those circumstances, he gave very well, highly honed answers marvellous ripostes and responses. But if you provided him with a question he hadn't thought about or he was uncomfortable about, he shook it off and didn't answer it. I know the difference. I'm a complete sucker for questions. I want to answer the question very badly, even if it leaves me in a place I'd rather not be, too vulnerable. But I could see that Jordan Peterson took a different approach. And so when I mentioned this problem I had with Jung and the fact that I had resorted back to Christianity and its more specific articulation of personal diabolic evil, he looked quite alarmed and said, no, this is all much too Manichaean for him, and he wanted to keep right away from that. Well, now, I've had this conversation.
Now, that sort of surprised me, and I'd love to know more context in there, because Peterson can, in many of his conversations, be very much the story of the world is about good and evil. Peterson, in his meaning talks about good and evil regularly. And of course, if you go back into the Cambridge Union talk, he talks a lot about evil, and he talks specifically about Auschwitz and the cruel joke, and that each of us is capable of evil. So a little bit of more nuance and clarification would be helpful in terms of the comments that he just made here.
Conversation a number of times with academics in the past, theologians, intellectuals, and others, and I've come to realize that the moment someone uses the word Manichaean, it's a code word. It tells you immediately that they are proposing to place, what I suppose I'd call the Johannine articulation of good and evil, light and darkness, in a dualistic structure, and they don't want.
Now that's going to lose a few people. He's definitely he's talking about the Gospel of John and the Johannine, the epistles of John, the book of Revelation. I've spoken before about especially 1 John, which there's a lot of debate as to whether or not it's epistle or perhaps it's an appendix to the Gospel of John to treat some sort of docetic or Gnostic or interpretations of the Gospel of John. It's in 1 John that you find the Antichrist. And if you read 1 John, you will see all of this antithetical stuff, light and darkness, good and bad, Christ and Antichrist. It's very antithetical. And so that's his comment behind the Johannine.
Want to go near it, and they were proposing to place, what I suppose I'd call the Johannine articulation of good and evil, light and darkness, in a dualistic structure, and they don't want to go near it, and they straw man it by saying, well, this is Manichaean. It's interesting that C.S. Lewis, as I've said many times before, I'm sure you know, said that when it came to dualism, he wanted to call himself as much of a dualist as the New Testament allowed him to be, which in his view was a considerable amount.
Now, if you look at Ashenden, quite clearly he told Karen Wong that, he had this experience of demonic attack, and he called a Roman Catholic priest who was a friend of his and said, you're going to basically have to recruit Mary. And so that was very formative in terms of his story. These are still very interesting comments he's making, because again, we're hearing these conversations through him.
But Peterson went right away from that, and I can see why, because I think in one sense this is, if you like, the vulnerability in his armour. This is something that he hasn't thought through and doesn't want to think through. Well, that's absolutely fine. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, there's a time for everything. And he and I had a conversation that ranged widely. I heard him later talk in a podcast with Jonathan Pageau and Bishop Barron and another American psychologist.
I guess we just brought Vervaeke into the U.S. Congratulations, John! You're an American citizen now.
Whose name begins with a V, I think. About how recently he'd been got at by a religious type and who'd showered him with dogmatic propositions that he found immensely difficult and wanted to run away from, screaming. Well, I was glad it wasn't me, but it could have been, except that I wouldn't have done that to him. So,
Ashenden is a fan. He really likes Jordan. So he's by no means he's thinking about these as friendly critique.
We now have the recount of the morning session between 9. Well, actually, it was a whole day, 2.5 hours in the morning, and the same in the afternoon with 9 other academics. Interestingly, 3 were, I think, what I would call Gnostic agnostics.
That's a very interesting categorization.
Of whom Peterson was one. There was another professor who'd written a very powerful book on the mind, and another one who'd come to lecture for me when I was at Sussex, who wrote about morphic resonance.
That must be Rupert Sheldrake.
And was a extremely well qualified biologist, but wanting to move beyond the strict parameters of scientism as it presents itself. So we had these 3, and then around the table there were 6 of the rest of us, who I think would describe ourselves as orthodox theologians, intellectuals, academics, disciples, whatever.
Small or orthodoxy.
And so battle began. The morning session is quite difficult to describe. It was quite abstruse. It was intellectually a high octane, and I'm not sure it would have been of huge interest to the general public. It was academics mud wrestling, crossing swords, and one of the things Peterson was trying to do was to set out a thoroughly intellectual rejection of scientism. It was a marvelous moment when he said the problem with I think he said you religious types, or it might have been some religious types, but it was a bit disdainful, and I think was a moment of self-disclosure, is when you were arguing with Dawkins, he said, you allow him to set the parameters of what reality is, and then you lose the argument because you've let him set the context and the terms of engagement. And that was the point when I said, well, actually, Jordan, I think that's what you're doing with us now. I think you've done the same thing from an agnostic point of view. And then we discussed that for a bit. He said something really, I thought, very helpful. He said the postmodern conundrum is a problem of perception. We don't know how to reduce the infinite number of things we could perceive to those things we do perceive. And so one of the things he wanted to do.
Now, that's a very interesting take, because it's obviously very much what he was discussing in the Four Horsemen video. It's obviously what he's discussing with Bishop Barron. It's quite clearly the problem of cognitive science, that the world is full of many, many things, and how do we deal with that? Now, in some ways, that's a problem of the third-person perspective, because the third-person perspective is sort of a frame shift by which we imagine we see all as it is. But we can't see all as it is. So in some ways, Pageau's first person is a way to address that, because then we see what we see. And there's obviously limitations on that in terms of our capacity to perceive, but there's also pre-experiential filters going on. In many ways, Jordan Peterson's first conversation with Sam Harris, no, not his first conversation, but his conversation at Vancouver the first night, was all about those filters. That was the argument that Peterson was trying to set up in that conversation. And Sam Harris, I've likened that conversation to 2 kids in a playroom, and Jordan's trying to build something, and Sam trying to build something with Sam, and Sam just keeps knocking it down. That was part of the problem of that. And I think Peterson addressed the dynamics of that well in the Cambridge Union talk when he referred to the Sam Harris talk, and he said, I've stopped trying, in a sense, to win arguments and more to have a conversation. And it's right there that, again, we switch sort of from the third person perspective, which is very much attempting to, well, I'm going to it's sort of like Satan bringing Jesus up to the pinnacle or up to a high mountain to show him the kingdoms of the earth. And what is forgotten when Satan brings Jesus up to a high mountain to show him the kingdoms of the earth and say, all of these I rule over. And Jesus is like, you're not telling me anything I don't know. In fact, I'm seeing all of this far more than you are. And to sort of pull Rene Girard into the conversation, you rule over them by your mode of rulership. Okay. So this is where the first person and the third person help, because the switch from the third person to the first person, which is what I think Jordan is working on and why he really appreciates Pageau, because Pageau has just kind of done it. But Pageau doesn't have science to contend with like Peterson does. Because to be a scientist is to be a third person, to say, here is the world as such. And as such is almost, here's the world from a monarchical vision. Oh, well, how can you tell us? Because all the telling is coming through the first person. Because language is all, it's all of my words are rung through time. All of my words are paced through time. So there's some second person in there because I'm talking to you. But it's all going serially. It's not this. It's not turning the light on in a warehouse and suddenly seeing all the boxes. So Peterson's stuck in this frame shift in that he's seeing how, well, from the first person, the observer is obviously integrated into the view. Whereas from the third person, as Peterson says in the transliminal videos before the status rocket ride, you take the person out and you sort of imagine you're God to do that. But you can only act really in the first or the second person. You can't really act in the third person because you've taken your agency away, you've taken your perspective away. So it's clear that this is something that Peterson is trying to come to terms with.
Do is to suggest that one of the great hierarchical principles that we needed to use to interpret perception and reality was narrative. Well, this is very interesting, of course, because
because narrative, again, is all first person. And we watch each other go through narrative. And again, that Strawn wanted me to do a full commentary on his conversation about narrative. And I said I would rather hear Vervaeke talk to that individual because, John Vervaeke is the one who has expressed some real questions about narrative and saying that we're overusing narrative, because in many ways I'm on narrative side, because I think the way that you reintegrate the subject is with narrative, and that seems to be how we're deeply programmed to process the complexity and the multiplicity and the personal perspectives of the world.
Certainly from a Jungian point of view, the narrative of the archetypal struggles that Jung and depth psychology are profound are always enormously engaging, and we find them in all the myths of our culture. Myths are narrative, and in that sense myths are some of the truest things we can ever experience. Wonderfully, of course, for Christians, the idea of narrative as being the overarching hierarchical value takes us very close to St. John and his description of Jesus as the Logos, the primary principle who is spoken, the Word, and the organizing principle behind the universe. Well, of course, Peterson knows this only too well and treats Jesus as the most eminent of archetypes, both as the Logos and the supreme exemplar of narrative, and also as an archetype in himself. As we'll discover later on, this becomes a kind of belief in a proposition. All the way through, Peterson quite rightly was dismissive of Christians who take refuge in axioms and dogmatic principles, and also philosophers and intellectuals who use propositions all the time.
Okay, and so again, you can hear the echoes of what Peterson's processing, where at the end, now in the recession of modernity, there's a recognition of the overdependence on the propositional. Again, the propositions, verbal propositions, are sort of lower register, an attempt to bring lower register into upper register and freeze them so that they can be much more easily brought into the third person.
And yet, his belief in an archetype becomes really quite close to belief in a kind of proposition, except, I suppose.
And in some ways, archetypes are propositionalized narratives. Think about them that way. They're propositionalized narratives because you have the archetype of the judging father or the devouring mother. There's, a few years ago, Apple came out with these, you could take a picture. LG did it first, I think, or it was LG or one of the other phone companies. Apple's usually late to the game with these things, but you could basically take a picture and the camera would record a little bit before, a little bit after, and it's sort of like a motion still. In some ways, that's what an archetype is. So it's a propositionalized narrative. And again, we as human beings, we're really adept at working on these things. And so you could see now with the recession of modernity, propositionalized narrative would be a very handy thing when you're dealing with a public that is a little fearful of narrative, let's say.
Is that archetypes are fluid and dynamic, and they do their own work in linking consciousness and unconsciousness. So they're not as static as most propositions are. He said a number of very helpful things during the discussion about the limitations of science, for example. Although one of the things he was trying to do was to sell his credentials as a psychologist and an intellectual for producing a different map of meaning, which of course was the title of his first book. He very helpfully, I think, said what science does is describe the terrain that we're in. He says, look, this is how it's made up, this is how it works. He said, but what it doesn't do is to give us a map.
Okay, so there's the lower register. It's the terrain that we're in. It doesn't give us a map. Well, what is a map? A map is sort of taking up the elements of the lower register into the upper register and reifying them, making them static. So if you find, I remember when I was a kid, my mother had to go to LA for a wedding. I always loved maps. And so I told my mother, bring me back a map of LA. That's all I want from Los Angeles is a map. Now, if I were to be able to find that map, which I'm sure I can't, and open it up today, some things would be the same and some things would be different because the city is alive and it's changing and it's moving. But maps in that sense are sort of, we take things up from the lower register and put them in the upper register.
But we desperately need a map as human beings. And one of the crises of our time is...
And then so we take maps in the first person and then we bring them down, and part of what you do when you learn to be a good map reader is you sort of see it up there in the third person. Here are the streets of Sacramento. And then you translate it into the first person and you see, the left and rights and the intersections. And then, but when you're looking at them serially, well, now you're going to go through this way.
Nihilism is that without a map and with this great collapse of meaning, we're faced with the nihilism of postmodernity, and above all, a vacuum.
The section in the little live stream we did today on more comments on the transformational mysticism, part of what happens in postmodernity, and I thought, again, Mark had a great point in this, is that postmodernity that says there's no grand narratives. And then we're just all simply reduced to being tourists. I think it was Bauman Dreer wrote about that. I've mentioned it in a few videos. We're sort of tourists, but there's no maps. We're just sort of wandering around the street, one thing to another. We're not pilgrims. We're not heading someplace because it's the grand narrative that allows the emergence and the emanation to reconstitute meaning in lots of different places.
And into that vacuum has flooded will to power, a Nietzschean value. And he goes on to say, quite helpfully again, I think, that the religious, when it's not working properly, collapses into the political. And the way that's done is exactly in the way we experience postmodernity. And
That's the hole in the culture where the church used to be.
cultural Marxism, the whole politically correct movement, which has become a kind of religion. But it's not a religion of love, it's a religion of dogmatism, of propositions, but above all of power. What it attempts to do, as we know only too well, is to change the hierarchies in society, putting minorities and the excluded at the very top as an attempt to produce a fairer and more egalitarian society. Of course, as we discussed so many times, it's a kind of three-card trick. Diversity, inclusion.
And he's spent a lot of time on the culture war stuff here, and that's been a big part of his story in his departure from the Anglicans and his embrace of Catholicism. This section on the sacred was interesting.
But that would have been a shortcut in this particular conversation. And interestingly, Peterson was trying to build what he called a nest of priorities. And right at the bottom, amongst this nest, there was literary authenticity and depth, was the sacred.
Now the sacred, if you understand the first person and the third person, you can very much understand the difficulty of the sacred from the third person. And John Vervaeke talked about that, I thought, well, in the Four Horsemen video, where all knowledge is... So you're up at the top of the warehouse. All knowledge is accessible to you from everywhere. It's in a sense flat. Whereas from the first person, if you're walking through the warehouse, well, there's shelves and they're stacking, and you can very much see the necessity of the sacred when you're coming through in this way, as opposed to up here. Up here, in a sense, nothing is sacred because everything is flat. It's all the same. But that doesn't work because as you live your life, you have to live it first personally and move in that way. And again, Peterson is sort of trapped between the frame shift of the third person and the first person, whereas Pageau can quite easily inhabit the first person and can we talk about the third person, but he's not trying to do especially social science, which is something that it could very well be does not last in the transition and the recession of modernity.
And so we had some discussion about the sacred, but it seemed to me that Peterson hadn't worked his way through the implications of the sacred. One of the things I discussed with him was the influence of William James. And what William James did is to look at the sacred and say, this is one of the most important things that happens to people, and we can judge how valid it is by whether or not it affects any changes in their ethical behaviour. This is a very good yardstick. And Peterson laid himself wide open for a debate on this when he said that that for alcoholics, there was nothing that worked to free people from alcoholic dependency, except one thing, and that one thing was a religious experience, or the kind of program that AA embarks on, which is effectively a form of group psychotherapy set in the context of a religious narrative.
Now we get back into this question of transformations, and we've been calling them mystical experiences. Maybe let's call them frame-breaking experiences, and so sort of link it into the shamanistic tradition, because the shamanistic is in a sense the frame-breaking. It's the moving the shelves in the warehouse. It's the rearranging them. And if you look at the song Amazing Grace, I once was blind, but now I see, the appropriation of the word enlightenment. Those walking in darkness have seen a great light. It's amazing how much visual reference goes into these kinds of things. We say when people have these frame-breaking experiences, they're having a vision. And again, this is very much sort of a first-person perspective. And what happens in, let's say, AA is that the frame must change from a person who is, let's move this out of the way a little bit. The frame must change from a person who is looking at the world and saying, I am a victim, everybody is wronging me. Resentment is sort of the warm water of the hurricane that has been their life. And what, AA's, its steps are amazingly subtle and crafty in that initially the alcoholic doesn't have to completely let go of their victim status. They are powerful. They are powerless before alcohol. So they're still a victim, but they're no longer so much a victim of the family that abused them, or the family that disappointed, or the people in their lives who have failed them, and they're a victim of something. And then of course you bring in a higher power that can release me from this. Okay. And so the talk about hitting bottom is in some ways a frame-breaking experience, because they come to a point where they realize things must change. The parable of the prodigal son, there's a lot of debate as to that moment in the field and interpretively where that goes. And those of you who've been with the channel long enough know I've talked about this in the past. But there's this frame breaking, and then now suddenly a difference of perspective can lead to new practices and ways of living.
And so again, at that point, for those of us who are Christians, this is a very good moment to say, well, you have to take the sacred seriously. And as William James discovered, there are plenty of examples of where the implosion of the sacred into the life of the despairing, broken person is the one thing that really does remake them. And therefore we have a lot of empirical evidence for the fact that the sacred makes an enormous difference, and therefore ought to be one of the most important values that we look to as we interpret the human condition.
And if you talk to addicts, for example, who have worked through AA, the little coin that they get with a certain degree of sobriety, the meetings, all of those things become sacred. And, well, what is sacred? Sacred is always related to the frame, because in many ways, the frame is the sacred, in that it's the one thing you won't deconstruct. It's the one thing you won't take apart. It's the stance through which you see everything else. And if you give that up, then you can't see anything.
Make a hierarchy of values in order to establish the way in which we're going to live with meaning, and the particular map we're going to provide ourselves with. In the afternoon, one of the better parts of the discussion was an argument about the Trinity. And you might think that will be hard to pull off. But it was because one of the agnostics wanted to look at the Trinity and say, to their great surprise, that the reality modelled so much of the Trinity in its tripartite aspect. And we had a really rather enjoyable discussion, because the orthodox among the table began to come in and say, actually, you've got it the wrong way around. You're making the Feuerbach mistake. You probably know that Feuerbach said there is no God, and the reason we think there's a God is because we project all our need for a father figure onto the blank screen of the universe, like an inverted telescope. And Christians say, well, Feuerbach got the telescope the wrong way around. It's actually God projecting onto us his character. And the reason why we think about God and respond to God, respond to the models and archetypes of the sacred is precisely because, as St. Augustine said, Lord, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Only God himself can cure the God-shaped hole that we have within us, and Feuerbach was wrong to suggest that it was a matter of projection.